What's up, guys? New World Economics here, and this is a reaction to a video put out a couple weeks ago, or actually just probably a couple months ago by now, by Eastory, which is a history channel. Actually, pretty good one. Does pretty good with military history and battle history, and has pretty good graphics as well. This is titled "How Ukraine Was Able to Survive." I think this is a really good assessment of the situation, so we're going to go through and do a little reaction video to it.
When Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the odds were not equal. Russia spent 10 times more on its military than Ukraine and had an overwhelming superiority in military equipment. The Ukrainian military could not resist it for long. Ukraine's only hope was to receive help from its allies. But Ukraine needed to survive long enough on its own for the help to arrive. This video will cover how Ukraine was able to hold on. But before we proceed,
I think that's that's already a pretty good start on like Ukrainian strategy. Like we haven't heard some like truly good assessments of like, if you're Valery Zaluzhny, who's the commander of the Ukrainian army, and they obviously knew this was coming long before February 24th. Of course, you had the U.S. and Joe Biden talking about it, and in December and January, and they were talking about it as if Ukraine had no idea. And there's some stories that Zelensky was basically calling Biden behind the scenes, like, shut the fuck up. Like, we know it's coming. We're trying to get prepared, but what you're doing is like you're basically causing a panic over here, and you're wrecking our economy, which produces tax revenue that we need in order to fight this thing. So like, obviously Ukraine knew this was coming for a long time. They've been fighting the war in Donbas for 8 years. So, they had a long time to think about the strategy here, which obviously they knew Western support would come, but they would have to hold out until that came.
Message from our sponsor. Let's say that you are going on a secret mission before
I don't want to.
Well, yes, it can.
Guys,
of 2022, Ukraine relied on the help from its allies, but in order to receive it,
now we got commercials.
Ukraine had to hold on. Russia could use its superiority in equipment to quickly encircle and destroy the weaker Ukrainian army by using blitzkrieg tactics. Ukraine hoped to counter this with appropriate tactics. One tactic was to fortify its troops in the cities. This would force the Russians to fight in urban terrain, which is very costly for the attacker. The second tactic was to strongly defend a suitable part of terrain. These defensive advantages would be enough to nullify the Russian superiority in equipment and allow the Ukrainian forces to hold on. Ukraine hoped that these tactics would allow its forces to survive the Russian invasion long enough for its allies to send help. We still don't know many things for sure about the war, and the following is my opinion on how the events unfolded. The invasion was launched from 3 directions. The decisive offensive of the first period of war took place in the north, and we will look at it first. The Ukrainian troops had fortified themselves in the larger towns, while the Russian invasion forces were stationed in Belarus and Russia. The Russian plan was for the special forces to land near Kyiv and topple Ukraine's government, which was expected to shatter the Ukrainian resistance. The ground forces were to use that and occupy the major cities in the region. But the special forces' assault failed. The ground forces moved in, but they were too weak to conquer northeast Ukraine on their own. In the north, the Russians occupied the small undefended cities but failed to capture Chernihiv. On the southern part of the region, the Russians got quickly stuck before Ukrainian defenses in Sumy and other smaller towns. In the center, the Russians secured the city of Konotop under their control and continued forward. They bypassed the town of Nizhin and reached Kyiv's suburb of Brovara. But the Russians had dispersed their forces near the Ukrainian cities, and the troops that had reached Kyiv were too weak to launch a proper assault on the city. They had to halt their offensive. At the same time, the second Russian attack came from Belarusian territory north of Kyiv. Without large cities to hold them back, the Russian forces quickly reached the Ukrainian capital. They now began to storm the city. Part of the forces moved south to cut off the supply route into Kyiv, and the others battled towards the center of the city through its suburbs, Bucha and Irpin. But then the tide began to turn. The Russians had not destroyed the Ukrainian army, and it now began to attack Russian supply lines. In addition, Russia had only some tens of thousands of troops near Kyiv, while the city's population was just under 3 million. Having armed part of the city's population, the Ukrainian forces gained the upper hand and started pushing the Russians back. The Russian command realized that the Russian forces in the area were too weak to take Kyiv and lacked forces to even properly maintain their supply lines. The order was given to abandon the campaign and withdraw their forces completely from northern.
So, just real quick and going back just a tad so we can look and see what this total land coverage was. I mean, and I've basically, this is my assessment, just way better said. But how this special forces attack went and like how close it actually came to toppling the government in Kyiv, I don't know. I don't really know very much about that at all. Of course, there were reports on the night of the 24th of gunshots and fighting in central Kyiv in the government district. So we do know that there was, something going on there. And of course, you have the paratrooper assault on the Hostomel or Gostomel airport, which is slightly north of Bucha. But other than that, looking at this entire land coverage here, I've calculated that there was probably less than 70,000 Russian troops total. Maybe even less than 60,000, although I think that's a bit of a stretch. It's probably you're looking at between 20 and 30,000 troops coming down from that Belarus front, extending down to Bucha on this western side of Kyiv here. That's where actually the highest density of Russian troops would have been. Hence, the most intense fighting did take place in Bucha and Irpin. By the time these forces got to Brovary, I mean, there wasn't anything to them. There are some definite takeaways from this and some things that even I have suggested since then. Now that we're talking about Russian recently mobilized forces, there's over 200,000 that are in Russia and Belarus that haven't been deployed to the combat field yet. Should this same plan be attempted a second time with less of a special forces pizzazz on it, it might be successful, because you're looking at if 20 to 30,000 troops are on this western side of the Dnieper River in Kyiv, then anywhere from 40 to 50,000 troops, depending on that number, ended up assaulting Sumy and capturing Konotop, partially surrounding Chernigiv, and several of these major cities here. It would have been a lot easier to control this territory had they committed, 50% or 100% more forces the first time. And considering now, at this point in the war, with the majority of Ukraine's forces being tied down in the Donbas, where the majority of the active Russian forces are as well, should Russia launch a second attack trying to take these roads and stuff, it might prove they might prove to be more successful in terms of capturing Sumy and Konotop and Chernigiv. These cities are in the far north of Ukraine. They're very isolated. If you look at the road systems here, they're not really connected to these roads. They're not on the way to anywhere. They're just strictly roads going to Chernigiv and Sumy and some of these places here. There's not a lot of interconnectivity. It's probably why Russia was so successful in driving so far through Ukrainian territory with such thinned out forces without getting stopped in the first place. So, I think should this be attempted again, if Chernigiv could be captured and Sumy could be captured for the Russian side, they probably could isolate this entire part of Ukraine. The value of doing that, I'm not exactly sure. It certainly would put the Russians a lot closer to Kyiv. It would put Kyiv under threat. That would give them, I guess you can say, more leverage in any kind of negotiations. I don't think per se this is a territory necessarily that Russia would be looking to annex. I think the populations, in Chernigiv and some of these places, while they're actually very sparse, they're mostly Ukrainian and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainian, which is important to note. Whereas, when you get into Kharkiv and some of these places where there's a large number of Ukrainians, most of them actually speak Russian. So they would be, easier for Russia to control. These territories would probably prove to be kind of difficult They might at this point just serve as some kind of leverage should Russia try this again. But to sum that up, basically with the failure of the special forces assault on the very first day after that happened, this entire operation was a failure because it was just undercommitted. Wasn't enough troops. Couldn't possibly capture a city with 3 million people with a force this size. It's completely impossible. And the Russian side, should have known that a month sooner than they actually did. So I mean, they deserve a fair bit of criticism there for keeping up an attack for an entire month. I guess maybe they assumed well, we're already in here, we've already driven this far, might as well give it a try. But a lot of people view this situation as a massive defeat of the Russian forces in the Battle of Kyiv. There was a huge battle here, and Russians were defeated and took heavy losses around Kyiv. It wasn't necessarily the case. There really weren't that many battles on the eastern side of Kyiv. Some token clashes. The biggest battles were in the Bucha and Irpin direction, but you're talking about, basically a month of fighting, and not even hardly some of the hardest fighting that's taken place in Ukraine so far. There's been a lot tougher situations for both sides outside of Kyiv.
The order was given to abandon the campaign and withdraw their forces completely from northern Ukraine. In the beginning of April, the Russian forces had pulled out from northern Ukraine to fight another day. At the same time, there was fighting in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. In eastern Ukraine, there was the industrial region of Donbas. This region offered much better opportunities for defense, and Ukraine decided to dig in here. After the
Eastory, just a quick side note, Eastory actually has done a separate video that I almost did a reaction to. I might still, but he talks about historically how, in the last 100 years alone, how many battles have been fought for specifically this Donbas region. And there's very specific tactics that need to be used to win here, which, some signs have shown a little bit of knowledge of, but neither side has really found an upper hand here. This is actually very interesting how many modern mechanized armies have come in here and tried to fight in this area and have had a lot of trouble. It presents a much larger defensive obstacle than I ever realized. Just based on how built up and dense it is. You can see that by all those little dots there. Those are all the industrial zones and towns with large apartment buildings.
The fighting in 2014 and 2015, the region was split between Ukrainian-controlled territory and lands controlled by the pro-Russian separatists. Ukraine had built strong fortifications on the line of contact and now made them into a part of the defensive line. In the north, the Ukrainian defenses were set up behind the Siversky Donets River. The defensive line was strengthened by the existence of several cities, with the cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol serving as the corner points. When the invasion commenced, the Russian forces occupied the undefended area north of the Ukrainian defensive line. At the same time, they launched an attack against...
I'm not entirely sure of that claim there that area, northern Lugansk, was entirely undefended. It took the Russians the better part of 2 months to actually secure that territory. I'm sure there were some areas and stuff where the Ukrainian side was definitely pulling back. But Ukraine actually put up some pretty staunch resistance in the areas that are currently seeing combat now near Kreminna and Liman. Before they just didn't let the Russians walk into these places. Even Kupiansk, I think, saw a little bit of fighting towards the beginning of the war. But I'm a little less sure of that area. More or less, I don't think Ukraine just completely walked out of that. I think they put up a little bit of a fight for certain key locations.
Against the Ukrainian defenses in the south. This attack was meant to support the Russian advance from the south, where Russia invaded Ukraine from the Crimea. The Ukrainians did not apply their special tactics there. Their forces were deployed near the border and were strongly disorganized during the initial Russian assault, which allowed the Russians to advance without encountering much resistance. In the east, the Russians' goal was to reach the Donbas. After defeating the Ukrainians at the border, they quickly took Melitopol. The Ukrainians were only able to regroup near Orikhiv and Hulyai-Pola, where they stopped the Russian advance. It allowed the Russians to freely advance in the south, where they took Berdyansk and approached Mariupol. This is when the attack against the Ukrainian Donbas defenses comes into play. It was a strong attack and broke through the Ukrainian field fortifications. With their positions outflanked, the Ukrainian forces took in the defense in the city of Mariupol. The Russians began capturing the city in urban warfare. They had to spend 2.5 months in heavy battles for the city until they managed to take it. At the same time, the Russian forces were advancing from Crimea to the west with the presumable goal of reaching Odessa.
See, just quick note about this Crimean axis of defense, and this I think is one of the biggest failures on Ukraine's part, and one of the biggest successes on part of Russia, where obviously Ukraine has had tons of success in its defense in the north and in the Donbas, but here in Crimea, this should have been one of the easier locations to hold back the Russians. There's a narrow land bridge at the base of this area you're seeing right here, where the Russians could cross over. You're talking like maybe like a mile or a half a mile wide. There's barely even a land bridge there. It should have been a very easy location to pile up forces and dig, heavily entrenched positions in and hold back the Russians. And same with the other side. There's actually not even a land bridge. There's just bridges in general. This is probably, in Ukrainian's defense, this is probably where Russia focused heavy efforts on, special forces and the element of surprise, but this should have been one of the locations that Ukraine had a big advantage in holding back the Russians and didn't manage to do so.
In the beginning of the invasion, the Ukrainian forces
This
were shattered
happened
by
in
the
the
Russians
time period of a
and
day.
had to
Both of
abandon the
these
Dnieper
directions,
River
the
line
lines were
and the
broken.
city of Kherson to the Russians. But then the Ukrainian forces regrouped in the cities on the southern Bug River. The Russians attempted to take Mykolaiv and cross the river, but they could not take it. They then moved to capture the breach at Voznesensk, but they could not take that city either.
That if you guys are interested, that battle for Voznesensk is actually very fascinating. It appears, and of course it's probably talked up more as a hero story, and the media's gotten a hold of it and probably changed it around some, but it appears like Voznesensk was held basically completely by local militia, like just townsfolk and stuff that were given spare AKs. There probably was some army there, but it seems like by that point the Russian elements that showed up in town had driven so far. They were pretty weak. They had obviously a very long logistics tail. This should tell you pretty much how prevalent Ukrainian forces even were in the south here. If Russia was able to, snake through the Ukrainian countryside here without any kind of counterattacks on their supply chains the entire time, outside of, the TB2s and, Bayraktars and stuff attacking their supply lines, then, Ukraine was really in trouble in the south. Had Russia, once again, same story as within the north. If Russia had committed larger amount of forces to this thing from the beginning, they probably could have captured, large swaths of southern Ukraine, pushing the Ukrainians, pretty far back from the Dnieper River. And had that happened, it's hard to say that, they would have been able to destroy the Antonovsky bridges and create the supply problems that Russia has faced recently. So big failure in planning on Russia's part here. They've had several opportunities throughout the war to capitalize on aspects of the current situation, and they just completely failed to do so.
The Russians abandoned their plans of crossing the southern Bug and pulled back to more defensible positions. They then consolidated their defensive positions on the southern part of the front. During February and March, the Russians had stretched their forces out along the whole front. They had made inroads into Ukrainian territory, but failed to encircle and destroy much of the Ukrainian army, which allowed Ukraine to continue the resistance. Now they deployed them in one place. They pulled out their troops from northern Ukraine and stopped the advance in the south. They concentrated only on the Ukrainian-held part of the Donbas, with the goal of encircling the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians hoped that their defenses on the Siversky Donets River and their field fortifications would be strong enough to prevent Russians from breaking through. In the south, the Ukrainian fortifications were weaker, but for reasons that are not fully clear, Russia did not choose to launch major attacks there. In order to cut off the Ukrainian forces, Russia needed to cover 160 kilometers. the main attack would be launched from the north. The town of Izium was just in the way of the Russian forces. The Russians assaulted it, but the Ukrainians were able to hold on for the whole month of March. The time the Russians had spent on taking Izium gave the Ukrainians the time to understand the Russian plan and prepare a strong defense. The Russians ran into heavy resistance and during the month of April could only cover very little ground. The Russians realized that they had little chance of breaking through. They adopted an easier goal, with their objective being to cut off the Ukrainian-held cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. The distance to cover was 50 kilometers. The fighting took place mostly in late April and May. The Russians approached the Seversky Donets from the north, but then they realized that crossing the river was too risky. The Russians switched their main effort to the southern attack. Here they gained some ground, but the Ukrainian defenses held on until they could bring strong reinforcements. This meant that cutting off the Ukrainian forces would prove too difficult. The Russians then decided for an even simpler goal. They decided to approach the two cities from the south and encircle them that way. During the month of June, they took this territory and Ukraine had to pull its forces out to avoid encirclement and Russia gained control over the cities. What happened next? Well, the front line did not move much for some weeks, and then this video was uploaded to YouTube. By holding out, Ukraine has been able to receive help.
It's interesting, same, like he's definitely right about that. It seems like the obvious strategy would have been to pinch off the entire Donbas with a southern thrust and a northern thrust, one coming from Izium, another coming from the south. He mentions that for reasons unknown, the Russians didn't attempt to one coming from the south. Specifically, the area he's talking about is, I believe the town's called Velika Novosilka. It's to the directly to the west of Ugledar. It's like a huge fortification. Russia did push there a little bit, but then stopped. I assume for the same reasons that Russia ended up withdrawing from the north of the country. They just didn't have enough forces. They, committed to the entire war. They've only committed. The initial invasion was basically 180,000 troops. Since then, they've withdrawn some troops. Of course, they've had some troops leave combat because their contracts are up. It's basically come to the situation now where they've had to call up reserves to deal with this issue and manpower. But basically the failures in that second operation could probably be chopped up to failures in manpower. Now, I agree with the assessment that Izium probably took too long to capture, and that's the primary reason why they weren't able to expand the bridgehead. Was it gave the Ukrainian side, even if you have, say like if they had 2 extra weeks to prepare fortifications south of Izium, more than enough to build trench lines. I mean, in a week you can probably build miles of trench if you have enough equipment available for it. So, all right, guys, that's it looks like we got another minute here.
From its allies, which has made the Ukrainian defense more successful. During the first month, Ukraine received a lot of anti-tank weapons, which has lessened the advantage of Russian tank forces. The Allies have also replenished Ukraine's stocks of artillery ammunition, which has allowed it to continue the struggle. The arrival of American anti-ship missiles has lessened the role of the Russian fleet, and the long-range artillery has helped Ukraine in general by limiting Russian supply flow.
Actually, I really like that assessment, because a lot of people claim, and this is ridiculous, but like the claim that a javelin is worth a tank, but obviously the tank, or a javelin's worth more than the tank because the tank is $2 million or $4 million and can be destroyed by a javelin in one shot. So having tanks is dumb. Like all you need is javelins. Like it's completely stupid. Tank operators, I'm sure, destroy plenty of anti-tank teams. Javelins are primarily, from what I understand, have been used on Urals trucks, like targeting logistics that are far behind the line. That's why, Russia has taken actually pretty heavy losses amongst Urals trucks, specifically from the Javelin. But he's saying that these weapons that have been supplied to Ukraine have acted to not completely knock out Russian advantages. Like like, giving a country javelins isn't going to make them invulnerable against tanks, but it lessens the advantage of having a large tank force, or it lessens the advantage of having a large navy if they have anti-ship missiles. It reduces these advantages and allows the other side to close the gap a little bit, but not necessarily completely. But yeah, anyways, very good assessment. I completely agree with his overall conclusions. I think basically Russia failed in the north, didn't have enough troops. They failed the Donbas because they don't have enough troops. We'll see. Now at this point they have enough troops. They've gone through this mobilization. The effectiveness of those troops, we'll see. But so far, Ukraine has actually surprised the world with a pretty good, pretty staunch defense, and a pretty intelligent defense, I think is more accurate. Now, when we're talking about losses and like some of these other things, of course, like it's a war and losses, are probably heavy. But for the most part, it does seem like, in terms of time, so far Ukraine has succeeded in its defense and have outplanned the Russian side. All right, guys, that's it for me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.